Right, well, welcome. We've got a very special guest. David Martin Jones is going to talk about History's Fools, which is his latest book I have right here. History's Fools, about the failure, or let's say maybe the decline of the progressive liberal worldview and its impact both on our domestic stability and our international stability. Very excited to talk about this book. David, thank you for being here.
Thank you for inviting me.
Well, it's great. I'm very glad that we get to talk about it. Could I ask you just to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm David Martin Jones. I'm originally a PhD of the London School of Economics in the 80s. And then I've had a largely peripatetic teaching career, which has taken in from about 89 onwards. I've been either in Southeast Asia or Australia. So I've taught at the National University of Singapore, at the University of Tasmania in Australia, and at the University of Queensland. And I've had several visiting positions at the University of Malaya in Kuala Lumpur, and at a Taiwanese university briefly. And more recently, I'm visiting professor in war studies at King's London.
So, David, the first thing I'm going to ask you to explain is how you get to such an eclectic knowledge base, because particularly in this book, History's Fools, it's philosophical, it's international relations theoretic, it's social scientific. You're certainly interdisciplinary, and your interdisciplinariness comes across in the schools you've taught at. So most recently war studies, and later we're going to talk about international conflict, which is one of my specialties. But you have this very strong ideational expertise at the sort of political philosophical end of political science. So where on earth did you manage to be so broad in your political training?
I think it's the product of well, my undergraduate education and my master's and early interest in doing a PhD was grounded in history, and particularly early modern history. So my degree was a history degree at Reading University, and then I did a master's at McMaster in Canada. And briefly, I was in a PhD program at the University of Toronto before finding it too cold and too financially limited. So I took eventually took a scholarship at the LSE, where I came under the influence from being quite sort of, I suppose, libertarian, but on the anarchist wing of politics, to coming under the influence of a department that was still shaped by Michael Oakeshott and figures like Ely Kaduri and my supervisor at the time, Kenneth Minogue. And that sort of led me into a more, I suppose, conservative appreciation of political ideas and the languages of politics, which was the understanding that prevailed with Oakeshott's thinking that dominated the political philosophy end of the government department at the LSE, which has now completely disappeared, actually. But it was those thinkers, I think, that affected me in my early postgraduate work, and was the basis of my work on 17th century political thought, which was the PhD I wrote, which subsequently came out as a book on conscience and allegiance in 17th century political thought with the University of Rochester Press in the 90s. But in between, rewriting the PhD for a monograph, my first academic appointment as a lecturer was actually to the National University of Singapore, which at the time the leading figure in Southeast Asian studies in the UK was a professor in the government department, a very sort of thoughtful character called Michael Leafer, who became the pro-vice chancellor. And he was seen as probably one of the leading authorities on Southeast Asia and sort of the Southeast Asian geopolitical problem in the Cold War. And so he had good links with Singapore, which then, I got a place there in 1989 and taught there for 5 or 6 years, which fundamentally altered my appreciation of what East Asia or Southeast Asia was and how it was politically and economically organized. And, it was in that period of Singapore's Asian values approach and the emergence of, in the West, that idea of the end of history and Fukuyama's writing, which came out, 89 was the essay on the end of history, and then the subsequent book, 1992, on the end of history, coincided with my writing that actually the Asian model was not susceptible to an end of history liberal democracy. And states like Singapore were very well organized under an authoritarian capitalist kind of ethic, which has continued on. So I wrote, as a result of writing a few pieces on Singapore for the national interest, and then a broader comparative study of culture in the Asia Pacific for comparative politics in 1996. I suppose I got more interested in Asian political thought and tried to sort of marry those understandings with what I understood of an Oakeshottian tradition of traditions and languages of political thought, which are not subsumable to one universalist model, but reflect the contingent circumstances in which state and statecraft emerges. So that was I suppose, the way I began to incorporate or adapt what I thought as a classical liberal approach to the more conservative Asian traditions. And then when I was in Australia, I found the manner in which a lot of Australian academic discourse was engaging with Asia as some kind of utopian project from which they could then criticize Western understandings, even though Australia was fundamentally dependent on a Western, a Western philosophy and Western economic, or the open trading world that the United States had created after 1945, and which Australia was a huge beneficiary of. Yet the universities seem to think, well, a lot of the university departments, particularly of international relations, seem to see America as a hideous blot on world history, and China as the source of, after 72 and the opening to China, and Whitlam, the Australian Labor Prime Minister's, openness to China after 72, that this was where Australia's destiny lay in Asia, and adjusting to an Asian worldview. This seemed to me a massive misunderstanding of the kind of politics and leading, or the leading ideological developments in East Asia, which were discounted whilst there was this continuous attack on Western values and what was seen as outmoded Western ideas, under this attempt to develop some understanding of universal norms. So I became more and more interested in in critiquing this critical theory that became, that I've observed becoming more and more dominant in Australian universities after I went to first Tasmania in 1995 and then to the University of Queensland in 2004, and finding that there was this absolute kind of commitment, well, not commitment, but an absolute openness to critical theory, but a tendency to discount anything that wanted to say there was something valuable in the Western political tradition. And increasingly Australia, like a number of European and obviously American universities, became reluctant to look at the history of the European political canon and the values it held from, you know, the classical period through particularly to the early modern period, and the understandings that evolved to shape the modern world with, you know, philosophers like Hobbes or Locke or Rousseau. And instead of looking at that tradition to sort of dismiss it as a dead white male phenomenon and start all kind of political thought as a kind of critical thought, beginning with the Enlightenment, with a version of Kantianism that was read through a mixture of Habermas, Derrida, and Foucault, that led to a kind of academic Maoism, which was interesting because when I'd been in Singapore, I was very interested in, I wrote a book on the image of China in Western social and political thought, and became very interested in the way that Maoism got translated into Western thinking from the early 70s onwards, particularly through the French deconstructionists, the Tel Quel group, who went to Maoist China in 71, 72, and wrote very favorably about the Maoist experiment without noticing its numerous downsides, like poverty, famine, and the you know, the ability to wipe out anybody who was a critical observer of Maoism.
Right, well, thank you, David. So you just mentioned the word liberalism several times, which is almost how you begin History's Fools, which I'm trying to show here. Now, you chose to begin this book by anchoring it with Francis Fukuyama's liberal democratic triumphalism, and you placed it within a broader ideational consensus, which you called the progressive liberal worldview. So can you explain to us what is the progressive liberal worldview, and particularly in differentiation from classical liberalism, which you mentioned in your previous answer?
Yeah, well, that's you know, an important question. The understanding I have, or I'm trying to, I suppose, explore in the book, is that obviously the liberal project starts out in the 17th and 18th century with the, you know, the emphasis on the idea of the individual, of individual freedoms, but it is also keenly involved with the idea of equality and equality of opportunity. So what seems to, I suppose, you know, so if we looked at the Cold War, liberalism is still part of a Western package, and liberty, you know, whether it's in the States or in Europe, liberals and conservatives are fairly undifferentiated, one could broadly say. The end of the Cold War, and obviously what liberals in a classical liberal sense and conservatives share is a deep distaste for the totalitarian experience of communism in Eastern Europe and in in East Asia, notably China, and a sort of an awareness of social democracy, but a skepticism towards it and its welfarist extensions. That would be the classic liberal worldview, and it would work within a conservative liberal context of politics in the statecraft or the domestic politics of Western European states, but particularly the UK, the United States, and Australia and New Zealand, with their well-established two-party systems. The end of the Cold War is one of those hubristic moments. You know, liberalism, the market, seemed to have triumphed globally. There was no alternative. All isms became wasms, it seemed, overnight. And there was this great sort of, almost triumphalism, I suppose, of the West and the success of its economic model and the political model that went along with it. And this is the context, of course, of Fukuyama. Although to his credit, Fukuyama is somewhat skeptical. You know, he doesn't sort of say Asia will embrace it immediately. And he does notice there is a strong Asian administrative state. But it's other writers like who follow on from Fukuyama in that Fukuyama-esque vein, like Thomas Friedman in The Lexus and the Olive Tree, or a number of regular writers for the Wall Street Journal, like Charles Kreithammer. They kind of take it even further, that this is almost inexorable. This is the way that the new politics will go. And it becomes the foundation, not just of a classical liberalism, but a new form of liberalism, which becomes progressivism, that emerges from it around third way politics in the UK, with figures like Anthony Giddens, thinkers around Bill Clinton, like Michael Sandel, communitarian thinkers, all bringing up the Rawlsian understanding of social justice. And with this modification of classical liberalism and the always understood within the liberal mind of its understandings being universalizable, which would have been okay if it was just the market and the idea of promoting democracy. But the idea that social justice, equality, transferences of wealth should now be part of the fact that these Western democracies have become so successful, their promotion that they have no ideological competitors, and presumably it would seem no economic competitors, although the decision in terms of globalization to transfer industries to cheaper parts of the world without taking care of your own industrial and working class base has huge consequences. Nevertheless, the sort of the liberal progressive package increasingly abandons the state and goes for the international and promotes international orders. It promotes regional orders like ASEAN in Southeast Asia, or the European Union or the European Community in the 90s in Europe, and looks to global institutions like the WTO and the UN as the promoters of these sets of views that will promote both democracy, human rights, and economic leveling by promoting development in Asia as a universalist package, which increasingly deviates from a classical liberal preoccupation with the individual, because this is increasingly a collective pursuit of an elite vision of an equal but universally governed condition that is subject to international norms rather than state sovereignty, which increasingly draws a divide between those of a more conservative libertarian character and those who embrace the more progressive aspects of this market vision. And that sort of division becomes sharpened, particularly after 2001.
Yeah, so you know, you do a good job in the book of listing the various failures of the progressive liberal consensus, particularly in handling jihadism, in assimilating the migrants that result from open borders, and the failure of international peace. So in its own terms, particularly the liberal democratic triumphalism of the progressive liberal consensus, in its own terms, because it foresaw perpetual peace, stability, economic prosperity. In its own terms, the progressive liberal consensus hasn't worked out.
No.
So why is that? And I know I've actually heard Francis Fukuyama speak this year, and he doesn't. You know, he didn't persuade me that he had an answer for that. So he sort of talks about, oh, in the book I hedged against this and I hedged against that. So if you take all my hedges together, you'll see that I've predicted everything that's happened anyway.
He's an interesting figure.
Yeah. So that's not the way I read it.
No.
So
it is interesting when he now appears, I've noticed, whereas the essay in National Interest, 1989, has the end of history ? The book is the end of history and the last man, full stop, right? So when he's ever on talk shows now, he's referred to as the end of history ? rather than the full stop version, which is obviously a Fukuyama-esque equivocation, really.
Yeah. Yes, you know, he often calls himself a social scientist, and I'm not sure that's mostly true. I don't think that's mostly true. He's a philosopher, and much as I love philosophy, sometimes philosophy can be unfalsifiable, right? And there's a whiff of that.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, you know, coming on to this progressive worldview and the way it took off is that, you know, its preconditions were the economic success of the democratic market state, but its consequences was to unleash the capacity for an academic critique saying, well, okay, you know, communism as an economic model failed, but nevertheless, capitalism and its liberalism is a form of instrumentalist reason, which is problematic and leads to discomfort and marginalization of minority voices. And we must now undermine that instrumental reason of capitalism with a more communicative reason that transcends the market conditions in which capitalism triumphed, and now pursue something more universal and more teleological in terms of social justice. And rather than talking about freedom, this new critical dimension that informs the progressive movement coming out of the Frankfurt School with add-ons from Foucault and Derrida, but also elements of Rawlsian social justice thinking, or post-Rawlsian social justice thinking in his later work on the law of peoples, is increasingly obsessed with something called emancipation rather than liberty, which clearly you know, indicates a Marxist Gramscian route rather than a Lockean or a Federalist Papers conception of liberty.
Yeah. So would you say that the progressive liberal worldview, it contains contradictions that undermine its chance of success, right? So one of the contradictions is that it incorporates Marxist offshoots, deconstructionism and postmodernism, and that sort of Marxism seems to contradict the liberal economics. And then there's the contradiction which you just mentioned there between the talk about freedoms, but the authoritarianism by which you have to achieve equality of outcomes.
That's right.
Yeah, please.
No, I think it became, I mean, there was always, as Isaiah Berlin would point out, the incommensurability of the liberal project with its concern with liberty on the one hand and equality or greater equality or equality of opportunity on the other. The problem, I think, is that the liberty agenda has been minimized, especially in terms of individual freedoms within our democratic states, which should be centrally concerned with upholding them, and a greater concern with the victimology of the oppressed, however globally conceived. Within liberalism, there was both a sort of a values project, which was, you know, the value of liberty, the value of equality, and how you had to balance the two in a political project, which would never lead to absolute perfection, because liberty and equality are in themselves incommensurable. So politics would always be the adjustment of, well, maybe we've allowed too much liberty for the entrepreneurial groups who've done very well and given not enough attention to those left out by the capitalist project. So, you know, two broad aspects of politics were what government had to address, you know, whether, you know, you have a more egalitarian party, social democrat, or a more libertarian one, say conservative liberal. The development since the 90s has been to sort of deny, you know, to really curtail individual liberty and go for a much more managerialist approach. And as, you know, the globalization project took in not only you know, massive transfers of industrial capacity to East Asia and elsewhere, and open borders, it also facilitated migration, you know, particularly in the UK and Europe, on a largely unprecedented level from the 90s onwards, which of course had implications for what some call the precariat class in European and American, you know, kind of low-wage jobs whose wages were being forced down and down. And the idea that government, instead of being within a coherent territory of rule over which it was sovereign and made adjustments, was concerned now with a managerial project which bought off minorities and proclaimed became obsessed with status of victims and the extent of victimization that had to be compensated for. So we went from an understanding of a politics of democracy where in a libertarian understanding or a Hamiltonian and Madisonian understanding, the citizen had rights within a state, which was a political and territorial unit. They weren't universal citizens. They were citizens of France or the United Kingdom or the United States, but they were all equal citizens. That idea of citizenry seems to have been diminished since the 90s and replaced with a government that is increasingly about adjudicating and allocating resources in terms of minority statuses. And these then are allocated resources according to a managerial formula that an increasingly homogenous progressive elite decides. And this has created a massive change, I think, in our understandings both of our internal order as a nation state or a political state, and our relationship to the external world, which has kind of come back to bite us, really. That's the revenge, I suppose.
So let's segue to that, because what I think is most impressive about this particular book, History's Fools, is that you are able to use your conceptualization of the whole consensus, the progressive liberal consensus, to explain failures at the domestic level and the international level. So two levels of analysis that too often in political science get taught separately, and even like liberal international relations theory is often taught without any grounding in classical liberal philosophy. It's just treated as, a separate. The Liberal Party is treated as an artifact of historical literature rather than having a connection. So you connect this consensus across these levels of analysis, and you find failures in both. So I think you've just articulated well the reasons for failures at the domestic level. So why does progressive liberalism or the progressive liberal worldview fail at the international level, where it rhetorically offered such promise?
Absolutely. Well, I think that's also a very interesting question. I mean, the key moment is obviously after 2001. And it's not so much the Afghan war, which is the good war, but the Iraq war and the massive reaction it causes in the West, particularly in Europe, but also to some extent in the United States and the UK. And you get this sort of almost surreal politics of saying this war in Iraq, particularly, but obviously in Afghanistan too, is not a war against Islam or an Islamic ideology. It's a war for maintaining peace, stability, and universal norms, and promoting human rights. So, and then the further incoherence is that whilst you're, particularly in the UK, promoting an aggressive attitude to a Sunni regime in Iraq or a Taliban regime in Afghanistan, at home, you're saying groups that are supporting ideologically an Islamist view of the world are, we can tolerate this. So there is an almost schizophrenic treatment of addressing what is essentially a religious conflict and its conflict with our understandings of democratic peace that were, retrospectively, obviously trying to foist upon a Middle Eastern world that doesn't particularly see it as core to their values and understandings. And at the same time, we're saying this is nothing to do with ideology. It's all to do with norms and peace. And yet they're not accepted in a Middle Eastern world, nor are they accepted in an Asian world who see certain virtues in the market, but no virtue in tolerating viewpoints that might contradict with the ruling party that has successfully transformed an agricultural economy into a thriving, capitalist experiment, whether it's in Shenzhen, Singapore, or South Korea. That although South Korea is, more democratic than obviously Singapore or the People's Republic of China, nevertheless, these Asian states do not promote the rule of law in the way that we understand it in Western constitutional understandings. So I think on the international level, there was this hubristic faith in a kind of Kantian development teleologically, and Rawlsianism fitted in with that. And then when it became quite evident that there were, because ideology was supposed to have finished in 1990, and yet we now learn that, well, Islamism of a, whether it's how we call it, fundamentalist or having a nationalist component to it, it is an ideology. It has an ideology of a Muslim order that is clearly contradictory to some of the Western understandings which we assume to be central to a secular worldview. And yet at the same time, we want to say that, okay, we want to tolerate this intolerant anti-secularism at home, but prosecute war against it abroad. This seems incredibly deluded, really. And the fact that, successive leaders on both sides of politics, whether it's Bush or Obama or Clinton, Blair, and Cameron, subscribe to this incoherent delusion. And the consequences of this are, with us today: the rise of the revisionist powers, the weakness of the West, and the incoherence of its current democratic politics.
Yeah. So let me turn, this question is essentially going to be about what happens next. So I've been waiting for a correction in this consensus, but if anything, and I'll speak for myself, you can give your own assessment, but if anything, this year, particularly 2020, the consensus has become more Marxist, which is the wrong direction. So it's got more hubristic and more internally contradictory, which doesn't bode well for a consensus that has failed us at both domestic and international levels. So what do you think is going to happen next to the consensus? And then a subsequent question, which I've tried to separate, is what we can do about it. So if in answer to this question, it'd be so good as to just focus on what you think is going to happen to the consensus before we talk about how we can reform it.
Well, obviously the latter part of the book talks both about the revival of revisionist powers, notably Russia and China, and particularly the Chinese model, the China dream, is a coherent global potential threat. I mean, whether it's has the legs to actually fulfill the China dream vision, which I would say is, a version of Mackinderism. It's got a geopolitical understanding that it can take the world continent, which would, be a significant development for that world continent. It might not particularly, America could be an offshore island of this event, as could Australia, presumably, maybe the United Kingdom and Japan too. But so that's that development has been so little understood in the period between 2001 and Obama's pivot, that because of the preoccupation with really a less significant area of world politics, the Middle East, which kind of dominated the American worldview, astonishingly, really, given that America had really had very little interest in the Middle East and had always consistently got it wrong, it seems to me. So that obsession and the consequences of it, of allowing a revisionist China and a revisionist Russia to become increasingly powerful, is now something geopolitically that I don't think we still have the awareness necessarily to get hold of. And the current, the new American administration looks like a back to the future arrangement. I'm Biden a long time, supported Maliki in Iraq, created the conditions for ISIS, really. And he's appointing Kerry, Blinken, these old, these guys who are supposed to be the progressive now look the outmoded, actually. And so there's a lack, a continuing lack in the West of an appreciation of what's hitting us economically and politically from the Indo-Pacific. Secondly, the big movement after 2016 in Western Europe and in America, populism, seems to have lost its, become a little deflated. The capacity for it to reinvigorate political debate in the West has now been undermined by the lockdown moment, which is so, has had such a differential impact globally on the West rather than the Asia Pacific or the Indo-Pacific, that whereas, say, before COVID, you would say there's still a capacity for us to revive the democratic, state-based nature of the political order that, is the condition of liberty. I mean, writers like Hannah Arendt said, freedom of movement, which is one of the 5 freedoms, is important, of course, but it's within a territorial area. It's within a sovereign state. You can't have free movement globally and think you've got the conditions for the experience of liberty. And economic liberty is not the most important liberty. It's the freedom of expression and association that's the key liberties that were the result of, as Arendt puts it, the American Revolution was far more important for liberty than the French Revolution, which was always about an equalizing mission for, looking after the poverty, the poor, the sans culotte, whereas the American Revolution was mobilized by wealthy, citizens who wanted freedom, not representation elsewhere. Now, when I concluded that book before COVID, I thought, Western democracies have been in crisis before. They have resources to come back. They can have the conversation and, say, well, the egalitarian culture, the compensation, the managerialism is not working. We need a correction. And you might have, the Johnson government in the UK seemed like, oh, some of these ideas can now be taken on. Within a nation state model that could be at the basis of a new liberal classical enlightenment, really. Post-lockdown now, the way in which lockdown has been handled in the West and the devastation of our economies that it's caused means that we're far weaker economically, far weaker politically, and even more managed, it seems, as a result of this lockdown, that the prospects for the West, I'm frankly, quite depressed about.
Yeah. So yes, I agree with you on I have a fairly pessimistic view of our current trend. I've been optimistic before and been disappointed, so I'm becoming more pessimistic. Now, your book ends with a conclusion and an afterword, and at various times you refer back to the West having been written off before but bouncing back. So it has strong institutions, and there is value in classical liberalism in itself. So however much you denigrate liberalism or conflate it with other things like Marxism, the value of personal liberty should re-emerge. So we should cycle back to the value of individual liberty and rediscover that. So there's some optimism in your book. Now, I hate to push you on estimating how likely that cycle back is, or how long it would take. But if there is optimism in your view of the future, how long are we going to have to wait for a cycle back to classical liberalism?
Well, again, that's a huge question. I thought last year that there were more voices coming out, from various areas of the political spectrum, really, not just on, from a conservative perspective, but from, serious liberal and social democratic voices, making the case that this kind of managerial universalism had led to all kinds of incoherences and problems, particularly for our understanding of what it is to be an autonomous individual as a rational, self-owning being. Now, and until last year, we were still successful economic and political arrangements. I mean, people didn't want to emigrate to China; they wanted to emigrate to Europe. Now, I mean, the post-lockdown environment has left our economies and finances in a mess. So that's going to take several years to dig out of the hole we've put ourselves in. Secondly, I'm very, the other feature that comes out in the book is the rise of AI, artificial intelligence, and the way that is deeply, is a very big assault on the idea of the self-owning liberal individual, when we know how easy it is to manipulate people via social media. And there's been a number of former Facebook guys like Evan Harris, I think his name is, who's talked about the ethics of the Google, Facebook AI model that is so driven insecurities, anxieties, and this social media world that is so antithetical to the conditions of a liberal discourse, which is conversation and rational engagement. Well, that's certainly what you don't get on Twitter or social media generally. So generally, I thought the representative model of Western democracy, with its liberal, social democratic and conservative voices, was capable of reviving itself in response to populism and the effects of globalization, that there would be a correction, as you said. Now I'm more sort of doubtful of it than I think I've ever been. I mean, the way AI is moving, these massive corporations, the division of wealth that is now global rather than local. We're looking more, I mean, if you were recommending readers for a course at the moment, it would be more Michels, Pareto and Mosca rather than Hobbes, Locke and Rousseau, I think.
Yes. I mean, I'm laughing, but it's a very pessimistic prospect that you're talking about there. So that segues into the last question. Irrespective of whether we should be optimistic at all, what can we actually do about this? What can we do to reverse this decline in classical liberalism and the triumph of this perverse progressive liberal worldview?
Well, I think it needs sort of a community of scholars somehow to be resurrected or enabled. I mean, there are very few journal outlets at the moment that you could, kind of promote a serious interrogation of these views through. You know, I mean, you can't think of too many academic journals that would take it on, because, you know, you go through the refereeing process. Even History's Fools, for instance, the chapter on international relations theory, which is in the Hurst London version, was not approved by the OUP New York distributor or referees. So it's short of a chapter in the US edition, because it caused consternation to a reader. You know, so we need sort of some people to come together to give us to give backing, some philanthropists, something like the Liberty Fund that seems to have lost its mojo a bit, to promote this sort of critical and skeptical inquiry into what has gone wrong, really. And it's only when, you know, it's only ideas that will make the change. And unless we've got a flourishing community of scholars who are taking really critical, not critical theory positions, will we get the beginnings of a reversal.
Yeah, well, I think we should note that both you and I are leading that critical writing through the Critic magazine of London, the new magazine of London, which is one of the few outlets for the sort of ideas you're talking about there. So I very much appreciate that magazine. I appreciate seeing you in it.
And you too, Bruce. Very good pieces you're writing.
Thank you for saying that. So David, I'm going to thank you. We've been talking about History's Fools by David Martin Jones. Sir, thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Bruce. It was brilliant.